Let's find our way to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul's second letter, at least his second uh, recorded letter. There's some who argue that there are multiple letters that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. I don't know that I would be in that camp. It seems to me that the evidence uh, could be pointed to show us that there were just these two letters, and it really doesn't matter. We have the two that we have, and we'll deal with those. Here in 2 Corinthians, there's a lot of kind of, I don't know what you call it, bookkeeping, housekeeping of I sent this person here, I sent them to you, and you need to do this kind of things. And we're in that section now in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 about the collection for the needy saints who are in Judea. Remember in 1 Corinthians, famously in chapter 16, that section we often quote when we talk about the collection on the first day of the week. He had given them instructions as the timing and the method of that collection. And now in 2 Corinthians, he's kind of reminding them, look, you made that commitment. You said you were going to do it. And so now let's follow through on it. A couple things about that. Number one, he has already indicated here in 2 Corinthians that this was a voluntary collection, a voluntary contribution, we might say, to those needy saints. It wasn't a command, he says, but it kind of became a command. And in this regard, that they had committed to do it. And so there's where an option becomes not optional. When you say you're going to do something, even when that is completely voluntary, now it becomes compulsory. You said you were going to do it, and now follow through with it. And so he's doing that. He's urging them to follow through, and he's doing that by kind of what we often do. It's by comparing and contrast. Remember with those Macedonian brethren, they've done it. They fulfilled their commitment. In fact, Paul, and this is not Paul's language, understand, but Paul says they blew me away because they was a group of impoverished people, but they gave beyond what they were able. Reminds us again of that little widow that Jesus observed who put in the 2 mites in the offering box. And I think maybe we have to be careful when we infer things in Scripture on our own. But it seems to me that maybe Paul is hinting to them that the Macedonian brethren are poor and they gave abundantly. You're not poor. And so, what's your excuse? Kind of, again, he doesn't say that outright, but there seems to be a little bit of that tug on the heartstrings. And so, let's talk just a little bit on a backup and talk a little bit more broadly about this collection for the needy saints in Judea. We see this coming for a long time, don't we? In fact, as early as Acts chapter 2, the beginning of the church, we see that there were collections taken locally, and that's really all they could be at the time because they were the only Christians, the only church in existence at that time, to assist one another. And it seems that we have a kind of a perfect financial storm that's happening in Judea, that at least three things are contributing to the need that was there, maybe more than three things, but three things that we see in Scripture. Number one, remember, on that day of Pentecost, Jews had come from all over the world. That's why we have the speaking in tongues in Acts chapter 2. Come from all over the world there to Jerusalem for that feast. And normally these Jews were compelled, the male Jews above a certain age were compelled to come. Usually you'd come and do that. We assume that they would come maybe for the Passover, stay for the Pentecost because it's just 50 days, and depending on how far away you lived and their modes of travel, you couldn't make it back and forth in both times, and then you would go home. Well, what seems to have happened that these who obeyed the gospel, that many of them didn't want to go home. They wanted to stay and to learn more and to participate in this new thing called Christianity. And so that adds a financial hardship. These people have their homes, their jobs, everything has been left behind. And so they now, and I mean this in the kindest of words, they become a financial burden upon the locals there in Jerusalem and Judea. And so they sell, we see that in the example of Barnabas in Acts chapters 3, 4, 5. They sell their goods to help these needy saints. And don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, that was a generous and a godly thing to do, but it becomes a negative is then when you now hit on hardships and maybe you would have otherwise. Now I can sell those possessions to pay my own bills and I don't have those possessions anymore. I've already sold those to help someone else. And so now the hardship will come, and I think hardship will come in a couple senses. A famine, and that's a common theme throughout Old and New Testament scriptures of the hardships of a famine in that agricultural society, certainly. And so the famine hits them. I think we also see that there was, and we've talked about this before, a big dynamic of financial persecution against Christians. We normally think of the stonings, beheadings, and imprisonments, and those would certainly be the worst forms of physical persecution. But there was also financial persecution. The people, and we won't delve deep into that, but they lost their income, lost trade, all those kind of things. And so it was just like you said, a perfect financial storm that hits there in Jerusalem and Judea that were affected particularly. And so now Paul makes the appeal, Paul and certainly others will make the appeal to these Christians in other places to send to their need. And so we get our New Testament pattern for benevolence from this section here. And so Paul on this journey is wanting to round up those collections and to return them to Judea. And again, he is urging these Corinthian brethren to participate as they had committed to. All right, so 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16, he says, "But thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you in the heart of Titus." So I'm not the only one who loves you and has cared for you. Titus does as well, for he not only accepted the exhortation, verse 17, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. And so Titus didn't just come see you because I twisted his arm and made him do it. He wanted to do it of his own free will. And verse 18, we have sent with him. Now, what we're going to see as we go through this, I think, if I, and you help me count as we go through here, and you only need one hand, it's not tough math, but I think he's going to list 4 people that are going to be involved in this transportation, if you will, of the collection. The first one is Titus in verse 16. Now in verse 18, we have person number 2. We have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. No need to speculate who that is. We don't know who that is. Again, they would have known, and apparently a lot of people would have known him. So we might, if we were going to guess, that's all it would be. It would maybe be someone who might be known to us. If he was known to those churches, maybe Paul had mentioned his name before. Again, we don't know. But we've sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. Verse 19, and not only that, but who also was chosen by the churches. So there's number 3, person number 3. So we've got Titus, the famous brother, verse 18, and then what we would just call him the chosen brother in verse 19. He who was chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself and to show your ready mind. And again, if we were sermonizing, we would talk about what we do when we give. It was to the glory of the Lord himself. It's not just to meet those needs. We talk about our collection on the first day of the week. We got to pay the light bill, different things that we do. And yes, it serves all of those pragmatic purposes. But he says there's a higher spiritual purpose, is that it's to the glory of the Lord himself. And it's a demonstration of our readiness. Verse 20, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us with this lavish gift which is administered by us. What's the point of verse 20? What's he saying there in verse 20? What's he trying to avoid in your own words? He's mentioned three participants, travel companions. He's going to mention a fourth one in verse 22. Why are these people, what's the importance or maybe even the necessity of having these people accompanying Paul?
I think probably because they were well respected, number one. Number two is having a group like that, they knew that, didn't have any ideas in their heads that something was going to be messed up with the money that.
Yeah, yeah. I think on a practice, and Paul doesn't mention this, but I would want those guys just as security. We read the story of a good Samaritan. What necessitated that good Samaritan is that thieves had abducted that man and beaten him and taken his possessions. And so, uh, you know, the more bodies you got, hopefully put a little bit of protection. Again, Paul doesn't mention that. That would be my thought in that. But yes, the stated purpose is that Paul says, I want this to be above board, not just in the sight of the Lord, but in the sight of men. And so it matters how this appears. Paul says, I don't want to just take that money, put it in my pocket, and then get to Jerusalem, and then you be thinking, did all of that money get to Jerusalem? Or did Paul, have a little bit of Judas in him? Remember, Judas would steal from that. And so we would say, I wanted this to be above board and above suspicion in handling this money. Adam?
Wonder if, when he says the lavish gift, I don't think that he is just trying to, butter him up about something that, Paul's always happened to be so sensitive about appearances. He actually was very proud of how much money there was. I bring this, look, Paul brought all this money in. Who knows how he got Paul brought all this money. And look, Paul's trying to buy his way into our influence here. And oh, see, Paul is, and we're going to remember that, and he doesn't want all the attention to go to him, that he doesn't want anybody to think that there were bad motives for him trying to buy his way into the graces of whoever, wherever.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an excellent point. That it's wanting to be above board and transparent in two regards. On the front end, that I'm not pilfering this money, and I don't want any accusations, any eyebrows raised of that. But also, yeah, so that you don't think I'm going in there and look, hey, look, I brought you. We all had that coworker, hadn't we? We all worked together on this project, and he tells the boss, look what I did, basically. And you're back there going, you did what? This was a group project, and you were the dead weight in the group. What do you mean you did that? And so, yeah, Paul says, I don't want any questions raised about what's, and there's another sermon lesson there for us, is that we need to conduct our lives in that way. That yes, ultimately and finally, remember Jesus said that we do these things not to be seen of men, but to be seen of God. But the balance of that is we do have some concern as to how we appear to men, particularly to our brethren, that we don't want any suspicion to be raised there. All right, verse 22. So we've seen three individuals: Titus, the famous brother, I want to call him, and then the chosen brother. And now we have number 4, verse 22. And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent. I take it that brother's a different brother than the other two brothers that were mentioned, or three, if we include Titus, that here. And what seems to me here is that not just that we've chosen 4 people, or that we collectively have chosen 4 people, but we've been, intentional in that. Who we chose. We chose Titus, who loves you and who you know We've chosen this other brother that everybody knows. And then we've got the one that you chose. So, if Paul chose the three, still, well, okay, now they're in it together. They're going to split the money three ways. And so, no, you choose somebody. And then we've got this one who has proved diligent, who's trustworthy, in other words, through his efforts, because of the great confidence which we have in you. If anyone inquires about Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker concerning you. So maybe of all of these four people, strangely it sounds to us, Titus may have been the least well known. And so if anybody got any questions about Titus, I will vouch for him, basically, he says. Or if our brethren are inquired about, I think that would be the other three, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. Therefore, and so get my opinion box over here, because that's all this is, reading between the lines. Have there been questions raised about the integrity of this collection, or is Paul trying to be preemptive in that? And maybe in his urging, remember, this is in the context of him urging them, look, you follow through, you give us money. I'm cutting the admonition. You give us money. And so maybe Paul is trying to cut off some objections as to what they might raise, or maybe excuses. Well, I don't want to give because I don't know where it's going to. If we're honest about it, or well, I won't throw you under the bus, I'll use myself. I'm that way a lot of times in giving to a charity. It's like, I don't want to give to this charity. I don't know where it's really going to go. Is that all that going into, even, and boy, I'm going to sound cynical here, but even the table set out in front of Walmart, there was one the other day, they were selling something for some women's group or organization. And I don't have anything against women, but I'm just like, I don't know you. I've never heard of that organization. Is this really benefiting women, or just the one woman who's standing at the table? I don't know. And if I'm honest with you, I'm reluctant sometimes to give because I don't know where it's going, and if it's really going to help, like in this case, needy women, or whether this is just a scam. If somebody's just setting up, and we've seen that in the news reports. And so Paul seems to be maybe saying, give, give, give. Oh, and by the way, we've got checks and balances here. This money is going to be delivered to the needy saints in Judea. So don't use that as your excuse not to give. Therefore, show to them, verse 24, show to them four people, and before the churches, the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. Bit of a guilt trip here on this, but remember, all of this is prompted by the fact that they committed to do this. Again, Paul is not even guilting them into doing something initially. If he's guilting them into doing something that they've already said they were going to do. All right, now chapter 9, really no change in the theme or discussion, now concerning the ministering to the saints. And again, let's pause here and talk more broadly about this, that this is, in fact, every example, every passage that we read in the New Testament about churches giving of a benevolent nature is to the saints, is to fellow Christians. So we limit ourselves to that as well. It seems to me that there may be a deeper spiritual purpose there. We talked about that last time, about our showing preference to family. But it may just be a very practical thing that churches cannot fix the needs of everyone. It's just not practical to be able to do that, and so it has to be limited in that regard. It is not, and Paul dealt with some possible objections, maybe real objections, and so let's do the same. That doesn't mean we don't care about needy non-Christians. It's just simply that's not our mission. That's not our objective. And so now, ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. In other words, I don't, and again, I think this maybe is a little bit of a tactic here. I don't have to tell you this. Well, obviously you do. You spent 2 chapters telling them that. But I think it's a little bit of again, maybe a little bit of a guilt trip. When it talks about helping the saints, I don't need to tell you. You're such a generous, kind people who are willing to open up their hearts and their pocketbooks. And so you can kind of see the tactic Paul is using here. So he says, "For I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians." So again, they had made that commitment. They had said we were willing. And so here's the sequence of event. Paul goes to Corinth. Corinth says, "We're going to help. We'll do that. Put us down." And now Paul goes to Macedonia and says, "The Corinthians have made a commitment. What about you?" And they said, "Yeah, we'll do that." For whatever reason, the Macedonians follow through quicklier than the Corinthians. In fact, Paul again is amazed at their generosity. And now he goes back and says, look, the Macedonians gave because I bragged about you. And so now you need to give because I'm bragging about the Macedonians. And he says, here was what I said to the Macedonians, that Achaia, that's the region in which Corinth was ready a year ago. And your zeal has stirred up the majority. And so your zeal, your enthusiasm, your willingness, as he said in verse 2, has been a motive. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect. And so let's just be frank of what Paul's doing here. Paul's using some tactics and some little bit of guilt. I can hear, every time I read this, I can hear my mother's voice in how she was trying to motivate me sometimes to do what was right. I've sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that as I said, you may be ready. Lest if some Macedonians, in fact, it's going to be worse. We're all going to be embarrassed. What if some Macedonians come with me? They won't just hear about it secondhand, but firsthand. If Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. And so I'm just giving you slipping you a note ahead of time to save us all this embarrassment that you said you were going to do this. I told them you said you were going to do this. And if I show up and if they happen to be there with me, boy, that's going to be egg on our face. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your bountiful gift beforehand. Again, notice that he doesn't say gift, bountiful gift. And so let's prepare you for that, which you had previously promised. Again, let's not miss that. We talk about Paul using these tactics to get them to do, but it was his tactics to get them to do what they said they were going to do. That you may be ready, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. Now, remember back in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that's what Paul had said, why they were to take up a collection, so that there won't need to be a collection when I come. You gather that together and have it setting ready in this money bag, ready so that when I come, there may be some urgency and some speed in my trip so that you don't have to do that when I get there. And so you do that ahead of time as an expediency. And so he's, again, urging them to that end. And again, it's a matter of generosity, not as a grudging obligation. Verse 6, but this I say. So here's how you can accomplish that. He who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, but he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. I don't know that I want to do this, so I'll assign it to you as a homework assignment. In the New Testament alone, how many illustrations, examples, and allusions are there to agricultural thing? That seems to be the go-to, doesn't it? And it's understandable. I think if the New Testament was written today in America, it would be very different. We're not an agricultural society. That's not to mean we don't have agriculture, but that's not the dominant of part of our culture as it was there. And so this is something, in fact, today, especially in city churches, big city churches, if you're preaching on some of these things, you kind of have to stop and be Mr. Rogers and explain, here's what a sheep is. And I know we live in a kind of a rural area here. It amazes me that sometimes I've encountered in times past what we call city kids that never even seen a cow. And that blows our mind. Even if you've never touched or raised or milked a cow. Think about how many cows you've seen just driving around. But there are kids today who've never even seen a live infant, even from a car driving by. And so our illustrations would be different. Theirs dominated this. And here's the common, very easy. Even if you don't know anything about agriculture, you can understand this. You plant 3 seeds versus planting 300 seeds, your crop is going to be very different. And so we understand the illustration, but do we understand the application? Now, I think we're kind of, we're reactionary people. And we recoil, rightfully so, at what is sometimes called the health and wealth gospel. You turn on your television, I think it's died down a little bit, not completely gone away, but a few years ago, maybe a decade or so ago, you turn on the television and watch the televangelist. It was all about money, wasn't it? All about money. And the principle was, if you give me money, then God's going to make you rich. So if you want to be wealthy, then you make me wealthy. And by the way, religion, finances, investing, anybody tells you that, run away. Because there is going to be one person getting wealthy, and that's the person at the top of that Ponzi scheme in that. And so we recoil at that idea that if you give, $1,000, then God's going to make you a millionaire. And that, understand, that is not biblical at all. But Paul does say, in talking about finances, he's talking about money, isn't he? Paul isn't going around and collecting, jars of tomatoes and canned beans. He can't take all those back to Jerusalem. He has to take money. And so he is saying, if you give, it'll be given back to you. And so there is a principle there, a principle that has been wildly abused in some religious circles. But let's not let the false teaching about a subject cause us to ignore the subject. And so Paul, there is this biblical principle that he lays out here. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Now, there's the question, reap what? Illustrations, we talked about the numerous agricultural illustrations that are in Scripture. Understand that illustrations, whether they're inspired inspirations or the uninspired illustrations that I might use in a sermon, they're always going to fall short. There's no perfect illustration here. When the Scripture says, likens God to some vineyard owner, obviously that doesn't mean that God's exactly like that. We understand that. And so they're always going to fall short in some way. And so we have to pick out the kernel of truth from that. We use the example of the illustration of the parable of the sower. I would argue that the parable of the sower illustrates a poor farmer. Here's a guy that just goes out and just throws seed. Almost like drive by in your car and just throw seed out the window. And I think we would all say that's not how farming is done. That's not how you plant seed, even in ancient times. You didn't just go out there kind of like the Johnny Appleseed idea of just, scattering seed and hope it finds. In fact, you can see that in that, if we make a mathematical formula out of it, 75% of the seed that he sowed didn't produce a crop. And so we understand that that's not the way You would sow maybe the way you'd sow grass seed, but not the way you'd sow a crop that you're trying to grow. And so that the point of that is not here's how you do agriculture. The point is here's how you do the gospel. That is what we do with the gospel. We're not, uh, with agriculture. That seed costs money, and so you're going to be efficient with it. But with the spreading of the gospel, we're not going to be efficient. We don't walk around with the gospel. I liken it to this, and younger people, just close your ears because you won't understand what I'm talking about here. But us older folks will remember. Remember when you had a film camera and you got maybe that roll of 12 pictures, and you'd walk around with that camera and you'd go, nah, nah, because you knew you only had 12 clicks, and so you'd be very careful with what you took a picture of, who was worthy and what was worthy of that, because you only had 12 clicks. Well, now with the cameras on your phone, we take pictures of all kind of. We don't care. Click, 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 click. That's the way we ought to preach. We don't preach the gospel like the old timey camera. Here's the gospel. No, no, you're not worthy of. You wouldn't listen, and you don't care about it. Yeah, no, we just scatter it. We're indiscriminate. We're wasteful with it. If you don't understand how I mean the word wasteful, we just scatter it everywhere. Is it going to take root? I don't know. Doesn't matter. I'm just going to throw it around. And so we need to understand that these illustrations aren't, perfect one-to-one, apple to apple. And so my whole point of that rant was this: he who sows bountifully will reap bountifully doesn't necessarily mean that if you give money, you give a lot of money, you'll get a lot of money back. It does say if you sow a lot of money, you'll get a lot of something back. And so my point is, it's not exactly the illustration of the crops here. You may get something back. It's not what you sowed. And so you sow a lot of corn seed, you'll get a lot of corn growing. No, you sow a lot of corn seed, you may get a lot of something else. Again, it doesn't work that way in agriculture, but it works that way with the gospel. And so it's not necessarily a financial transaction he's talking about here. You will be blessed. Does that mean I'm going to be, if I give $1,000, I'll become a millionaire? No, but if I give $1,000, I might be blessed in other ways. And so there's one possible way of interpreting and understanding that. Adam?
To, the more agricultural mindset here, the context of this parable, with this idea that he's giving here, in those days, what they planted was one less thing they got to eat. Every seed they planted,
Yeah.
kernel that they were going to grind to make flour for the bread or something. That's not true for us today. And so, you would think that in this specific chapter here, while we're talking about these people that are dealing with famine, where you've got the double idea that you're doing without now for something later.
Mm.
And so that's a really hard thing that, I would think that if I were the farmer in a famine, okay, I can either eat this now, or I can sell this now, or I can plant it to hope for something better later. And so putting this advice here, I think contextually makes a lot more difference too, because this would have been very hard. I'm the type of tight-fisted person. If I hear there's a famine, well, I've got to make sure and keep in case the famine comes for me next time. This is just kind of Christianity in a nutshell. Do without now for a better thing later. And it's just a hard concept to swallow all around for our worldly consumerism, whatever you want to say, our American idea.
Right.
It's meant something totally different than it does to us today.
Yeah. Good point. So I think there's three possible ways in which we will reap bountifully. One is maybe just heaven. Look, if you're generous and kind, that's one of the things God expects of us, is to be generous and kind, and you will reap bountifully eternally. That's one possibility. The other one is the one we've kind of alluded to. You might be blessed in other ways today, but despite what some of our religious friends may be teaching and believing, I do think there is a principle that says if you share financially, God's not going to let you starve. That God is going to come. Now, that may come through providential ways. And let's think about it this way. You got two members in a congregation, not here, but in some other congregation. One's just a stingy miser. He doesn't want to help anybody. Another one is he's always, you need some help, you need some food, you need something. And both of those people come on hard times. Who are we most likely to open our pocketbook to? We're going to help the generous one. And that may be the principle here. It's not that God's going to open up heaven and rain down gold bullions on you, but providentially through your brethren, they're going to see, oh, this fella's generous. When we were in need, he helped us. And so he's in need. Now, old greedy over here, he can starve. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good Christian principle, but that's just the reality of the way life works. And so there's maybe that principle there. So at least three ways, I think, in which if we sow bountifully, we will reap bountifully. Verse 7, so then let each of us, as he purposes in his heart. And so again, all of this language is the idea that this is voluntary, that this is decided on your part. Also, this is a verse that just completely eradicates the idea that we're under the old covenant tithe system. And I don't want to talk a whole lot about that, but tithe, is just another word. It kind of, even when you look at it, especially spelled, it looks like somebody misspelled tenth. And they kind of did, because that's really what the tithe means. It means a tenth, 10% of that. But I think we have a misunderstanding even about the old covenant tithe. Yes, they were required to give 10%, but that wasn't all they had to give. There were also free will offerings that were given. It's not that they did their taxes and then figured up 10%, and that's what they gave, and that's all they gave. There were other things they had to give to the sacrifices, their free will offerings, all kind of grain offerings, other things that they were to do. But this just shows that we do this as we purpose in our heart, not grudgingly or of necessity. And you don't do it, and we liken this, and I've used this illustration before. It's not like taxes. You pay your taxes, and nobody does that with a smile on their face. We all do that, but we do it because if I don't do it, they're going to come get me and throw me in jail and do all that. So that's why I pay my taxes. If I'm honest with you, I pay my taxes because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't do that out of the kindness of my heart. And I think that's probably okay in government, in our relation to that. But that's not the idea here, that you do it because if you don't, God's going to come and squash you like a bug. No, you do it because I've got needy brethren who need this. So you do it not of grudgingly or of necessity. It says necessity is the idea of obligation, that you feel like you have to. Grudgingly, the perfect illustration of that is back when we pass the plate, and you imagine here's somebody who has their contribution, and rather than, and the fellow's holding the plate there, he doesn't put it, and so the guy reaches out, he grabs it, and the guy, he kind of and then finally, and then puts it in the plate. That's the idea of grudgingly. Well, I don't want to do this, but I've got to. Reason for God loves a cheerful giver. And so the principle that goes beyond the idea of financial giving is that God isn't only concerned with us checking a box and doing something. God cares about the why. God cares about our attitude in that. Again, that doesn't just apply to the giving on the first day of the week. That's everything we do for God. Is the attitude toward it matters. 1 Corinthians 13 does that. If we do all these things, we don't do it out of love, it's nothing. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you. So again, there's that same principle of verse 6 that God's going to grace. Again, what does he mean by grace? All three of those levels, I think, still apply here. That you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have abundance for every good work. I do think there is a financial element to this, sowing and reaping, that God's not going to let you starve. If you give your last dollar to these needy saints, let's think about that widow that Jesus saw. She gave her last 2 pennies, we'll modernize it, her last 2 pennies. Does that mean that she just went home and just starved to death? because she didn't have any more. No, I think the principle here is God's not going to let that happen. Again, I don't think that means that she's going to become a billionaire, but it does mean that God's not going to let that woman starve because she gave her. God is going to providentially take care of her and us. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness remains forever. The he there is God. He has done that, and God's going to do that for you. And so you can't use the excuse. And I think what Paul is doing is whether preemptively or reactively, he is going through the list of excuses that might be given. Well, I don't know if this money's really going to get to them. Hey, we've got 4 men here that are proof that this is going to be. And well, if I give this dollar away, then I won't have a dollar. And that's, let's be honest, that's one of the greatest excuses given for not giving. If I give this dollar away, then that means I don't have a dollar. Well, God, he said, no, God's going to take care of you. In fact, he's going to bountifully take care of you. And again, I think there is a financial element to that. Not to the extent of the televangelist, absolutely, but I think he does say, God is just saying, if you're generous, God will be generous to you. He's going to take care of you, even in a bountiful way. All right, let's draw a line there at verse 10 and pick up there next time.